95% typography before. Whether or not that number is actually accurate, it's easy to see that typography is important in a medium where so much of our content is displayed in text. Starting with type and with typographic design decisions sets a good foundation for the rest of our design process. With type affecting so much of our content, it's a fundamental place for us to start. There are more and more web type options out there every day, which means we have even more reason to consider typography early. On this slide, I have screenshots from a number of web font providers, but this isn't even the complete list. This gives us near limitless options to choose from, all the more reason to look at typography early. Responsive web design changes the way we need to look at our web typography. When designing for a multitude of screen sizes, we look to designing systems and find ways to maintain consistencies across all the various ways our layout may be rendered. Strong typography helps keep a consistent feel across all these contexts. When your content appears with consistent typography across all the devices your audience sees it in, your site feels more familiar, even when the exact layout details may have changed. The realities of responsive web design also mean that we have to give more active consideration to the line lengths and reading comfort across various screen sizes. We can no longer expect the same CSS rules to handle our type in all layout situations. We need to consider typography when writing our media queries as well. Considering type carefully in a responsive design context can help your work look more like this, with fairly comfortable line lengths to read, and less like this example, where the line lengths are so long it's pretty much impossible to read this for very long. Of course, responsive web design isn't just about screens of different widths. Responsive design comes out of a realization that our work will be viewed on a large range of devices, and some of those might not even exist yet. Different devices have different capabilities, which also affects our typography. Last but not least, our typography choices are also impacted by overall page weight. We've become more and more aware that the speed at which our pages load greatly affects user experience. Lighter pages load faster, of course, so we have to keep an eye on our page's overall weight, and sometimes that impacts the options we have for typography. Overall, a responsive web design approach makes our typographic decisions even more important. In this course, we'll be covering all the things you need to know to make smart type decisions as you design and build your responsive websites. The term web font is applied to so many fonts these days, whether or not they were actually designed for the web at all. In this tutorial, you'll learn ways to identify quality web font choices, using research and testing them firsthand to make informed choices when you select your web fonts. Not all fonts for the web were made for the web. It's confusing, but it's true. There's a big difference between fonts that have just been run through some kind of automated generator and ones that were designed specifically and intentionally for use on the web. As designers and builders of the web, we tend to blame the browsers or the type designers for these rendering differences that we see, but that's not really the whole picture. There are a number of things going on behind the scenes that affect how our type is rendered in the browser. The operating system and the text rendering engine that operating system uses, the file formats that the font's available in, as well as preferences and settings that the user viewing our websites has actually set. The type designer is an individual, and the OS really only have a small part in that overall list. Both macOS and Windows, our two major operating systems, have unique text rendering options. These text rendering engines determine how the smooth vector shapes of a font's letter form will be fitted to the pixel grid we have on our screens. We won't get into great detail on these text rendering engines, but in general, macOS favors being true to the font's intended shape, which can sometimes come at the result of thicker lines and blurred shapes while it's trying to hold on to those curves, while Microsoft's engines tend to favor the crispness of a line, which sometimes comes at the cost of distorted or jagged edges on a shape. It's really a philosophical difference between the two approaches. Neither is right or wrong, but both affect how our type is rendered and how these smooth shapes are applied to a rather coarse pixel grid. And we have to deal with both of these when we're designing for the web. If you're interested in more detail about text rendering on the web, Typekit posted an extremely detailed and in-depth article on all the factors that affect text rendering in 2010. It's a few years old now, but it's still full of very useful research and a whole lot of detail. Hinting is another factor that affects how our web type is rendered. Hinting adds instructions to the font file about how to best render the letter forms. The text rendering engines differ in how they interpret these, but the amount of hinting included in a font file will affect how it renders. For example, this one we're looking at right now is perhaps not the best hinted font out there. You can see that the counters on our lowercase a's and e's have actually filled in at this smaller size, which makes it really hard to read. The best fonts tend to be those that were designed specifically with the web in mind. Ideally, you want to know if the font you're choosing has been designed for the web and if it's been hinted and what it was designed for. These are good clues to how it might perform under the difficult circumstances of the web. To find this out, you need to do a little research. Luckily, most type designers like to include the story behind the typeface and why they designed it and what problem they were trying to solve with it, along with the type specimens they include on their site. In this example, we're looking at the type specimen page for Adele on FontDeck, and along with this type specimen on the left, there's also a story on the lower right-hand side of the screen that tells you a bit about what the typeface was designed for and what sorts of purposes it might be best at. Some type designers will even suggest sizes that the font has been optimized to be used at. For example, on this page from the Process Type Foundry, they say that this font should really only be used at sizes greater than 14 pixels. These are important clues about what you can expect from the font, and it's also a good indication that web performance and rendering have been considered by the type designer. They wouldn't be writing about it if they hadn't thought about it. If you're particularly concerned about the rendering quality at small paragraph text sizes, look for font collections that have been created specifically for use at small sizes on screen. For example, the Reading Edge font collection by Font Bureau features 8 type families specifically designed to look great at small sizes. Another example is Monotype's eText collection, which takes some classic typefaces that were designed well before the web ever existed and adapts them for web reading on screen. Looking for fonts or collections like these will help ensure you're selecting a font that will hold up and stay readable in all major browsers. Some type hosting services also have hand-hinted fonts as a category when you're browsing their catalog, and that can be very helpful too. This is a screenshot from FontDeck where we're actually looking at the category of hand-hinted fonts. So every font in this list has been hand-hinted and will perform a little bit better. As we've been looking at, most fonts provide a font specimen page that we can use to perform our own browser testing. If you're not sure about the intended use of the font or what it was designed for, or if the font says it's a multi-purpose font, you can take these type specimen pages and test them in browsers yourself. If for some reason the font you're looking at doesn't have a type specimen page, you can create your own type specimen page using the web font specimen template provided by Tim Brown. Viewing these specimen pages in a variety of browsers will give you first-hand knowledge as to how the font performs. You don't necessarily have to dedicate hours and hours to finding quality fonts for use on your project or start from scratch every time. If you happen upon a font you find especially readable while you're surfing the web, you can use what font to identify what font that is and make a little mental note for future use in your own projects. It's a handy trick to have. You can even take it so far as to actually test those existing sites in different browsers yourself to see how that font holds up. You can find what font as a Chrome extension or as a bookmarklet for a variety of other browsers, and it's a really handy tool. Finding quality web fonts doesn't have to be difficult or time-consuming. When you're considering a particular font, first find the story behind it, and then check its type specimen page in a variety of browsers to see how it performs. Make sure the font meets your technical needs before you start using it in your design work.